What do you think that God might be asking you to do? It's a big start-off question, isn't it? I do know that, but it's actually one of the most important questions that we can ever ask ourselves. What do you think God might be asking you to do? Sometimes the answer might be as small as, will you just be still and listen? Sometimes it's about seeking and finding. Sometimes it can be as random as, will you walk around this room until I tell you to stop? Sometimes it might be as practical as, will you take this item to your next meeting? Sometimes people have heard God say, retrain for a new career or job. Sometimes they've felt a strong nudge to something like singleness, or to be an activist, or to leave something or someone hurtful behind. Sometimes people have just felt they need to phone someone or drop in and see them. Sometimes it's deeper, when sometimes it's like, change this in your work culture, change this in your family culture, or maybe for your nation. Or sometimes, will you help to change this on the world scene? Artists sometimes think that God says, will you paint this for me? Will you sculpt me this? Will you write this? Will you photograph this? Will you dance here to this music? People have heard God give them a call to go to a certain place or a certain people. Many people find God speaks to them through parts of the Bible, sometimes through music, sometimes through film. Very often, God speaks and it's a reminder, and he whispers, will you come away with me? I think what I've noticed is that often we can exclude ourselves from God speaking or saying something specific to us for this time in our lives, because we've got this idea in our heads about who God does that for. Like he only ever speaks to people who've got the whole of their theology sorted, and their life is well sorted. Their ideas about God are 100% right before they can hear him properly. I mean, honestly, if that was really true, would God use anyone? Is there any person, is there even any church that can honestly say their thinking about God is 100% right? They've got God all totally figured out. Even the disciples couldn't have said that about themselves. Bible writers tell us that God is a mystery. We can also have an idea in our heads that God has a certain group of people who receive his call, and the rest of us, we're just kind of, there for the ride. That's not true either. So imagine just for a second that God is asking every single person on this planet, whether we feel qualified and ready and spiritual enough or not, to partner with him in his ongoing, dynamic, complex, love-based plan to serve and bless his world. You might have a piece of paper and some pens with you already. If you haven't, then just pause this video for a second, humour me, go and get yourself a piece of paper and come back. When you come back, I'd love you to draw this on your piece of paper. Okay, now there are 6 questions that I'm going to ask you to consider that might help us in figuring out what God might be asking from us personally. Here we go. The first question: is there something that needs to be done that you are ideally placed to do? Don't just think big, think small as well. So, it might be as small as a random act of kindness or a role or a task, anything that actually needs to be done and you're almost perfect fit. Second one: is there an issue or a repeated pattern that just stirs up a whole load of anger in you? The right kind of anger where you feel like, someone needs to do something about this. Any of those things. Number 3, if you never needed to work again, and you could serve the world in any way you wanted to, what would you really want to spend your time doing? Number 4, what do other people say are the ways that you already bless them? You know, your gifts to them. Number 5, what experiences or events have you seen or heard in your life that have rooted themselves with you as inspirations to live differently? And finally, number 6, are there any things that you've felt God ask you to do in the past and they're still on your radar and you haven't yet done them? Now, before you spend a whole lot of time on these questions, I want to tell you a quick story. The story is from the sequel to Luke's Gospel. We call it the Acts of the Apostles. It could well be entitled, What the Disciples Saw Jesus Continue to Do Through Them. This little section that we're going to look at today is a bizarre, slightly sarcastic story, and it comes from the place that we call chapter 5. The story starts on a real high point. The disciples who hung out with Jesus, except Judas, he's not there anymore, they're like properly living the dream. They're all together for a huge festival called Pentecost, and God's Spirit has come and filled each of them in a hugely visual way. It was so inescapable that 3,000 people decided to follow Jesus for themselves because of that. Since then, all of those disciples have been meeting every single day in the giant Jewish temple. Literally thousands of people, as much as they can, meeting every day in the faces of the religious leaders who actually are in charge of the temple. The disciples have been preaching about Jesus, and God's been using them to heal people, to drive out evil spirits. People are literally lining the streets to come to them, and they're hoping that even Peter's shadow might fall on them, and maybe some of them will get healed as his shadow walks past them. The Bible tells us that on the one hand, everyone was afraid to join them because of the religious leaders and how they were constantly looking down at them, discrediting them. And remember, it's only like a couple of months before that these same people had seen the religious leaders and the Romans team up together to execute this Jesus that they're now talking about. So on the one hand, the people are afraid to join, but on the other hand, there are literally people coming to faith all the time. I mean, actually, they're coming to know God in crowds of both men and women. So one thing the writer of this passage, Luke, loves to do is draw out parallels between what happened to Jesus and what's happening to all believers. Surprise, surprise, what do the religious leaders do when they see all this teaching? How do they interpret this massive move of God? Well, they're filled with jealousy. So they do what every religious group has done when things don't fit their own interpretation of the Bible, and they want to stop it. They make threats, but their threats don't work. They make subtle statements for people to be aware of, that they need to be aware of false teachers, but these aren't working either. Their warnings are to only listen to what they're saying, but they're also being ignored. And their constant cries to stick to scriptural orthodoxy, all the way through Luke's Gospel and through Acts, they are also not working. People are loving what these disciples are saying and doing. And so the temple people have them arrested. The temple guards go to them, 4 of them, and they arrest these 4 people and they put them in this jail inside the temple. But the trouble is that what's going on with these healings and teachings, it actually is from God. So during the night, God simply sends an angel to the jail. The angel takes these 4 apostles that were arrested. Apostles, just another word for Jesus sent out people. He takes those 4 and he gets them out of the jail. And as soon as they know it, they're outside of the jail. And the angel says, go back into the temple and start preaching about Jesus. So that's what they do. It's dawn, and they walk right on back into the temple, and immediately they start talking about Jesus for people. Everyone else is still asleep. When they wake up at the usual time, they organise to have a meeting of the Jewish High Council. This is all of the important people that make up the religious part of how Israel works. It's the same group that organised to have Jesus killed. They send for these 4 apostles that they've arrested, who they think are in jail, and when the temple guards get to the jail, they find that even though the doors are locked and there's guards outside, there's literally no one in the jail. So as those leaders are saying to themselves, oh my goodness, where is all this going to end? Someone arrives and says to them, you know the men you put in jail? They're literally standing in the temple and they're preaching about Jesus again. Can you imagine the horror on the faces of the Jewish leaders? So they send the head guard out to arrest them a second time. But this time, they have to do it nicely because the public are really on their side. So they bring these 4 guys back again and they say, what do you think you're doing? We specifically told you not to teach or preach in this man's name again, and instead you've literally filled the whole of Jerusalem with your teaching. Plus, you're telling everyone that we're the ones who are responsible for his death. Now this is the brilliant part. It's the response of the disciples back to the leaders who have arrested them. These people are spreading lies and they're arresting them, and it gets worse as the book of Acts goes on. But the disciples just return and say this to them. It's God we need to obey first, and human authority second. We all share the same common ancestry, Abraham, just like Jesus did, and it's that same God of Abraham that we share who raised Jesus from the dead. You killed him, but God raised him up, and now he's seated at the highest place of honour in heaven. All we're doing is being witnesses. We're literally just talking about the things that we've seen and heard. By the way, they say, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God himself, lives in every believer. And if you would obey God, you'd know what we're saying is true. So the religious teachers have to send them off again, and off they go. After they've left, the religious leaders start babbling on to each other again about how awful it all is. One of their top teachers, called Gamaliel, at the time, Gamaliel is mentoring a young guy called Saul, who's going to become very important in the book of Acts later on. Gamaliel stands up and he tells them they just need to leave it alone. He says, listen, in my experience, if something really is just a good idea or a bad idea and it's just human, it just all fizzles out into nothing. But if it really is God at work, you can't stop it, and all that happens is you find yourself fighting against God. That never works. So everything settles down. So these 4 apostles, or these disciples of Jesus, they knew beyond everything that even if they were told by important people to stop what they were doing, they just had to do it. They knew that God had asked them to do this, to speak about Jesus. That's what they knew God asked them to do. Peter in particular, he knew that God had asked him to be a shepherd of people. This brings us back to the original question. Is there something that you think God is asking you to do at the moment? In my experience, if you ask this question, God, what do you want me to do? Usually, in some way or another, you do get an answer. So my prayer for us is that the questions that we showed you earlier on, that maybe you wrote them down on a piece of paper, or maybe you've just had space to ask yourself, is God speaking to me? This process will guide you into hearing maybe what God is trying to say to you. May his Spirit whisper to you as he's done all the way through history to people. May we not be limited by our own plans and directions, but only limited by God's imagination fused with us. Speak, Lord. Your servants are listening. Would you speak, Lord? Your servants are listening.